The year is 1810. The place is the rugged, sun-scorched terrain of the Iberian Peninsula. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, has cast his shadow across Spain and Portugal. Opposing him stands a solitary force, the last hope of the coalition against total French hegemony. We know this force well. We have seen them depicted in countless paintings, films, and history books. They are the Redcoats. They are the disciplined, stoic lines of infantry standing firm against the thundering charges of French cavalry. Leading them is Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke himself, a figure who embodies the stiff upper lip of the British aristocracy. The narrative we have inherited tells us that this was a British victory. It tells us that English discipline, Scottish grit, and Welsh tenacity combined to dismantle the Napoleonic war machine. We imagine the soldiers around the campfires speaking in the dialects of Yorkshire, the clipped tones of the home counties, or the rolling burr of the Highlands. We imagine their letters home addressed to villages in the shires of England. But this image is an illusion. It is a convenient shorthand that obscures a far more complex and far more volatile reality. If you could transport yourself back to the night before the Battle of Salamanca or the Siege of Badajoz, and if you walked quietly through the encampments of Wellington's army, the sounds you would hear would not fit the traditional story. Amidst the sharpening of bayonets and the cleaning of muskets, you would hear the distinct cadence of the Irish brogue. You would hear songs from the pubs of Dublin and the fields of Connaught. In some tents, you would not hear English spoken at all, but rather the lyrical flow of Gaelic. This is the hidden history of the Peninsular War. While the maps were drawn in London and the orders were issued in the King's English, the muscle that executed them, the blood that soaked the Spanish dust, and the spirit that broke the French will, was disproportionately Irish. To understand how Wellington defeated Napoleon, we have to look past the uniform. We have to look past the Union Jack fluttering above the headquarters. We have to look into the ranks, at the faces of the men who actually held the muskets. What we find there is a staggering statistical reality that historians have often glossed over. By the height of the Peninsular War, as the campaign ground toward its bloody conclusion in 1814, the composition of the rank and file had shifted dramatically. We are not talking about a small contingent of foreign volunteers or a handful of specialist units. We are talking about the core of the fighting force. Estimates from military archivists and regimental records suggest that by the end of the conflict, Irish soldiers made up nearly 40% of Wellington's entire army. In some battalions, that number climbed even higher. This means that nearly half of the force credited with saving Europe for the British Empire came from an island that the Empire treated as a colony. This fact changes everything about how we view the war. It transforms the Peninsular Campaign from a story of British projection of power into a story of imperial complexity, where the conquered became the defenders. It begs the question, why? Why did tens of thousands of young men from Cork, Tipperary, and Donegal flock to the banner of a king who denied them full rights? What drove them to fight with such ferocious intensity for an army that often looked down upon them? And how did their specific cultural traits, their aggression, their resilience, and their unique form of cohesion alter the tactical reality of the battlefield? Over the next 30 minutes, we are going to dismantle the myth of the homogeneous British army. We are going to follow the Irish soldier from the recruitment fairs of rural Ireland to the breach at Badajoz. We will see how they lived, how they fought, and how they died. We will uncover the secret weapon that Wellington relied upon, even as he complained about them. We are going to give credit where it has been overdue for 2 centuries. This is the story of the Irish in the Peninsular War. To understand the sheer scale of the Irish contribution, we must turn our gaze away from the battlefield and look instead at the rolling green fields and crowded market towns of Ireland itself. The early 19th century was a time of profound demographic upheaval. The population was exploding, surging towards 8 million. Yet the land available to sustain them remained finite. For the sons of tenant farmers and rural labourers, the future was often bleak. There was little land to inherit and even less work to be found. The spectre of poverty hung over the thatched cottages of the countryside, a constant and menacing presence. Into this environment stepped the recruiting sergeant. He was a figure of allure and danger, often accompanied by a drummer and a fifer, setting up his station at county fairs or outside the local tavern. He offered the king's shilling, a bounty that represented more money than a labourer might see in a year. But more importantly, he offered a way out. He sold a vision of adventure, of steady meals, of a uniform that commanded respect, and of a life beyond the muddy furrow of a potato field. For a young man with no prospects, the choice was often stark. It was a choice between the slow grind of destitution at home or the sharp hazard of war abroad. Thousands chose the latter. The British military establishment was well aware of this dynamic. In 1793, the government had lifted the ban on Catholics bearing arms. This was a pragmatic decision, not a moral one. The empire needed manpower to fight revolutionary France, and Ireland was the deepest reservoir of men available. The result was a flood of recruits. By the time Wellington took command in the Peninsula, the British Army had become an institution that was English in its leadership, but increasingly Celtic in its rank and file. There was a specific mechanism that facilitated this transfer of manpower, a system that acted as a conveyor belt from the Irish village to the Spanish front line. It was called the militia. The Irish militia was a home defence force, raised to protect the island from French invasion and internal unrest. It was a local institution, easier to join than the regular army and less daunting. Young men would join their county militia, learn the basics of drill and discipline, and get a taste of military life. Once they were in the system, the regular army recruiters would descend, offering bounties to men who would transfer from the militia to the line regiments. It was a remarkably efficient system. The militia acted as a nursery for soldiers, hardening country boys into recruits who already knew how to march and handle a musket before they ever boarded a transport ship. But we must address the contradiction that lies at the heart of this story. Only a decade before the Peninsular War began, Ireland had been convulsed by the rebellion of 1798. British troops had ruthlessly suppressed an uprising aimed at establishing an independent Irish republic. The memories of burnings, executions, and repression were fresh. How, then, could these same people turn around and fight for the very crown that had crushed them? The answer lies in the complexity of human motivation. History is rarely black and white. For the average soldier, politics was a distant abstraction. Loyalty was local. A soldier did not fight for the concept of the United Kingdom or the Hanoverian succession. He fought for his messmates. He fought for the reputation of his regiment. He fought because the alternative was starvation. The regiment became a surrogate family, replacing the clan or the village. The 88th Foot, the Connaught Rangers, was not just a unit of the British Army. It was a roving band of Connaught men, bound by shared language, shared hardship, and a fierce, insular pride. There was also a martial tradition in Ireland that transcended politics. Fighting was seen as a manly pursuit, and the British Army was the only game in town. The wild geese, those Irish soldiers who had fled to serve in the armies of France and Spain in the previous century, were a romantic memory. Now, the new generation of wild geese wore red. They brought with them a specific cultural energy. They were often described by their officers as difficult to manage in camp, prone to drinking and brawling, but possessed of a ferocious, almost reckless bravery when the firing started. This duality would become the hallmark of the Irish regiments in Spain. They were the despair of the provost marshal and the salvation of the general. As these thousands of men marched to the ports of Cork and Dublin to board the ships that would take them to Lisbon, they were leaving behind a country that could not feed them, to serve a king who did not fully trust them. They were an army of exiles, carrying their songs and their sorrows with them. And as they landed on the dusty quays of Portugal, they were about to prove that while they might have been born in poverty, they possessed a wealth of fighting spirit that money could not buy. When we think of the Peninsular War, our minds immediately conjure images of sweeping open fields, lines of musketry, and the clash of cavalry. We think of the glory of the open battle. But the reality of the campaign in Portugal and Spain was often far grittier, far slower, and far more exhausting. It was a war of sieges, of marches over punishing mountain roads, and of digging. Endless digging. And here, in the unglamorous back-breaking labour that allowed the army to function, the Irish contribution was foundational. Before a fortress could be stormed, it had to be breached. Before an army could cross a river, a bridge had to be built. This was the domain of the engineers, specifically the Royal Sappers and Miners. These were the men who worked in the mud and the dark, often under sweeping canister fire from French ramparts, digging the zigzag trenches that allowed the infantry to approach the walls. It was dangerous, terrifying work, requiring immense physical strength and a fatalistic kind of courage. Regimental rolls indicate that Irishmen were heavily overrepresented in these units. The logic of the recruiters was simple and somewhat cynical. The Irish recruit, often drawn from a rural background of subsistence farming, was accustomed to hard manual labour in a way that the urban English recruit from a Manchester textile mill was not. The spade was as familiar to them as the pike. In the freezing rain outside the fortress of Ciudad Rodrigo, or in the baking heat of the lines of Torres Vedras, it was often Irish muscle that turned the earth, built the redoubts, and laid the pontoon bridges. They were the invisible engine of Wellington's logistics, the manual labourers of victory who paved the road upon which the more famous regiments marched. But their role was not limited to the spade. As the army hardened into a fighting machine, specific Irish infantry regiments began to forge reputations that would become legendary. The British Army operated on a regimental system, where units were raised from specific geographic areas. This fostered an intense local pride, and nowhere was this more potent than in the Irish regiments. Units like the 27th Inniskillings, the 87th Prince of Wales's Own Irish, and the 88th Connaught Rangers became distinctive tribes within the larger host. The 88th, in particular, offers a fascinating case study. Recruited largely from the province of Connaught in the west of Ireland, these men were considered wild, even by the standards of the day. They arrived in the peninsula, often speaking Gaelic amongst themselves, looking ragged and unkempt. The rigid discipline of the British drill square did not come naturally to them. They were notorious foragers, a polite military term for thieves, expert at finding food and drink in landscapes that other regiments found barren. General Thomas Picton, a hard-bitten Welshman who commanded the division the 88th served in, had a love-hate relationship with them. He famously called them the Devil's Own, and often berated them for their undisciplined behaviour in camp. Yet Picton, like Wellington, knew their secret value. He knew that the very qualities that made them difficult to manage in peace, their aggression, their tight-knit clan loyalty, their reckless disregard for authority, made them terrifying in war. The British military machine took these raw, rough men and, rather than breaking their spirit, channeled it. They allowed the Irish regiments to retain their identity. They marched to their own tunes. They maintained their own internal hierarchies. This was the genius of Wellington's army. It was not a monolith. It was a patchwork of nations. And the Irish thread in that patchwork was becoming increasingly vibrant. By 1810, as the army prepared to move from the defensive to the offensive, the Irish regiments were no longer just bodies to fill the ranks. They were becoming the shock troops. Wellington began to use them as a blunt instrument, a reserve of ferocity to be unleashed when the lines were wavering or when a breach needed to be stormed. The stage was set. The engineers had done their work. The training was complete. The wild Irishmen, as they were often disparagingly called by their English counterparts, were about to show the world exactly what they were capable of. The war was moving toward the Spanish border, and the legends of the Irish Brigade were about to be written in blood on the slopes of Busaco and the walls of Badajoz. The spade was about to be traded for the bayonet. The test came in September 1810 on a rocky ridge named Busaco. Wellington had drawn up his army to stop the French advance into Portugal. The terrain was steep, a natural fortress, but the French Marshal Massena believed his columns could smash through anything. He sent his seasoned veterans scrambling up the slope, confident in their numbers and their momentum. As the French infantry crested the rise, breathless but triumphant, they expected to see the British line breaking. Instead, they found the Connaught Rangers. The 88th had been waiting in the reverse slope, hidden from view. As the French columns appeared, Colonel Wallace, the regimental commander, simply turned to his men. He did not speak of king or country. He spoke to their pride as Irishmen. With the French only yards away, the order was given to charge. What happened next was not a firefight, but a collision. The Rangers unleashed a terrifying cheer and slammed into the French column with bayonets fixed. It was violent, chaotic, and decisive. The French veterans, who had marched across Europe undefeated, were thrown back down the hill in panicked disarray. Watching from a distance, Wellington, the man who rarely gave praise, was forced to admit that he had never seen a more gallant charge. The wild Irishmen had held the line, but if Busaco proved their ferocity, the Battle of Barossa the following year cemented their legend. It was here that the 87th Foot, the Prince of Wales's own Irish, found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. Instead of forming a defensive square, they did the unthinkable. They attacked. Amidst the swirling smoke and the scream of grapeshot, the regiment lived up to their Gaelic motto, Fau a balla, or clear the way. They crashed into the French 8th Line Infantry, a unit that carried a Golden Eagle standard, a personal gift from Napoleon himself. To lose an eagle was the ultimate disgrace for a French regiment. To capture one was the ultimate glory. In the heat of the melee, a young Irish sergeant named Patrick Masterson threw himself into the centre of the French formation. Fighting with a desperate fury, he cut down the standard-bearer and seized the golden bird. As he raised it high above the carnage, his shout of triumph rallied the entire British line. It was the first French eagle captured in the Peninsular War. When the news reached London, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a sensation. The captured eagle was paraded through the streets, a symbol that the French were not invincible. And the men who had taken it were not the stereotypical stoic Englishmen, but men who marched to the sound of Irish pipes. These moments reveal a critical tactical reality. The Irish units brought a specific flavour of violence to Wellington's army. While the standard British doctrine emphasised discipline and firepower, the steady rhythmic volleying of muskets, the Irish regiments often favoured the cold steel. They had a psychological preference for close-quarters combat. The bayonet charge requires a suspension of the survival instinct. It requires a kind of aggressive momentum that overrides fear. The French conscripts, often terrified of the silent red lines, found the screaming, charging Irish regiments to be a different kind of nightmare. This aggression, however, came with a cost. It required officers who understood how to harness it. Commanders learned that they could not treat the 88th or the 87th like the Guards regiments. They had to be led with a looser rein. They had to be allowed their eccentricities. In return, these commanders got a force that could be thrown into the most desperate situations and could be counted on to advance when others would retreat. By 1812, the reputation of the Irish soldier was established. They were the spearhead, but the war was changing. The open battles of Busaco and Barossa were giving way to something darker. Wellington needed to secure the border fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz to open the road to Spain. These were formidable citadels, defended by determined French garrisons. Taking them would not require tactical brilliance or manoeuvring. It would require a direct assault into the teeth of the enemy defences. It would require men willing to walk into certain death. And once again, the army looked to the Irish to lead the way into the fire. The sieges of the Peninsular War were affairs of horrific, intimate violence. Of these, none carries a darker legacy than the storming of Badajoz in April 1812. The city was a crucial gateway between Spain and Portugal, and Wellington needed it taken immediately. But he lacked the heavy artillery to properly smash the walls, and time was running out. He decided to storm the breaches, gaping holes blasted in the masonry, before they were fully practicable. It was a gamble paid for in human lives. To lead an assault on a breach is a suicide mission. The first wave of men is not expected to survive. Their job is simply to fill the ditch with their bodies so that the men behind can climb over them. In military parlance, this lead group was called the Forlorn Hope. Volunteers were asked for, and despite the near certainty of death, the Irish regiments stepped forward in droves. They were driven by a mix of fatalism, the promise of promotion if they survived, and the dark allure of the plunder that awaited inside the city. On the night of the assault, the atmosphere was suffocating. As the signal was given, thousands of men surged forward into the darkness. The French were waiting. They had turned the breaches into slaughterhouses, mining the rubble with explosives and lining the walls with sharpshooters. As the British and Irish troops hit the ditch, the night exploded. Canister shot tore through the ranks, mines detonated beneath their feet. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of screams and explosions that drowned out orders. The Connaught Rangers and other Irish units threw themselves at the breaches again and again. They climbed over the burning bodies of their comrades, clawing at the slippery, blood-soaked rubble. For hours they were repelled, dying in heaps in the ditch. It was a scene from hell. Yet they did not break. While the main assault at the breaches stalled in a gory stalemate, another division, led by the dashing General Picton, managed to scale the castle walls in a separate attack. The city fell. But victory at Badajoz unleashed something primal and terrifying. The army, maddened by the slaughter they had endured in the breaches, disintegrated. Once inside the city, discipline collapsed completely. For 3 days, Badajoz was sacked. Soldiers went on a rampage of looting, drinking, and violence that spared no one. It is a stain on the reputation of Wellington's army, and it is a part of the history that cannot be sanitized. The Irish soldiers participated in this with the same intensity they had shown in the attack. The wildness that made them such effective shock troops had a dark flip side. When the bonds of discipline snapped, the result was chaos. Wellington was appalled. Walking through the camp after the sack, seeing his soldiers drunk and bedecked in stolen finery, he wrote his infamous letter to the Secretary of State for War, claiming, "We have in the service the scum of the earth as common soldiers." This quote has echoed through history, often used to characterize the British soldier of the era as a criminal. But people often forget the second half of the sentence. Wellington continued, "It is really wonderful that we should have made them the fine fellows they are." He was acknowledging a profound transformation. He knew that these men, these Irish peasants, these scum, had achieved the impossible. They had taken a fortress that should have been impregnable. They had endured a level of trauma that would have broken lesser men. The sack of Badajoz was the release of a pressure valve, the explosion of men who had looked death in the face and survived. As the army sobered up and the march continued into Spain, the survivors of Badajoz carried a new hardness. The Irish regiments had been decimated, but the core remained. They were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors of the worst the war could throw at them. They had walked through the fire. And as they marched toward the final confrontation with the French, they carried a grim confidence. They knew that if they could take Badajoz, they could take anything. The road to France was open, and the Irish were leading the march. But war is not lived entirely in the breach. Between the moments of sheer terror at Badajoz and the adrenaline of the charge at Busaco, there stretched months of marching, waiting, and enduring. It is in these quiet, grinding intervals that we find the true texture of the Irish experience in the Peninsula. To understand their resilience, we must look at the spiritual and social world they inhabited, a world that was often at odds with the army they served. Consider the spiritual burden carried by the Irish soldier. The British Army of the early 19th century was an explicitly Protestant institution. The king was the head of the Church of England, yet the rank and file were overwhelmingly Catholic. In an era where religion was not just a preference, but the defining pillar of identity and the guarantee of the afterlife, this was no small matter. For the English soldier, a chaplain was usually available to offer comfort, to lead Sunday prayers, and, crucially, to perform burial rites. For the Irish Catholic soldier, there was nothing. There were almost no Catholic chaplains in Wellington's army. The government in London feared that priests might foment rebellion in the ranks. This meant that thousands of men lived with the constant, gnawing fear of dying without the last rites. To a devout Catholic of that era, dying unshriven, without confessing one's sins, was to risk eternal damnation. Every time an Irish soldier stood in the line of battle, he was risking not just his body, but his immortal soul. They carried rosaries hidden in their tunics and muttered Hail Marys under their breath as the French drums began to beat. This spiritual isolation created a profound, silent brotherhood among them. They were a congregation without a church, bound together by a shared faith that their own commanders viewed with suspicion. To fill this void, the regiment became everything. It replaced the parish, the village, and the family. In the Irish units, the bonds between men were unusually tight, reinforced by the shared feeling of being outsiders within the larger army. They were the paddies, distinctive in their speech and their customs. They turned inward, creating a fiercely protective culture. If a man from the 88th was in trouble, the entire company felt it. If he was insulted by an English soldier, a brawl was inevitable. This cohesion was sustained by a vibrant, chaotic camp culture. When the marching stopped, the Irish bivouacs were the loudest in the army. Music was their escape. Contemporary diaries from English officers often marvel, sometimes with annoyance, at the singing that drifted from the Irish lines late into the night. They sang ballads of home, rebellious songs disguised as folk tunes, and raucous drinking songs that celebrated the very act of survival. And they were not alone. Following the army was a massive, moving city of civilians, the camp followers. These were the wives and children of the soldiers who marched the same dusty roads, endured the same hunger, and often displayed the same courage. A disproportionate number of these women were Irish. They were the unsung heroines of the war, washing uniforms in freezing rivers, foraging for food, and tending to the wounded. There are accounts of Irish wives walking through the aftermath of battles, turning over bodies to find their husbands, or carrying them on their backs to the surgeons. They provided a domestic anchor in a sea of violence, reminding the soldiers of the humanity they were in danger of losing. This distinct culture, this mix of fatalistic Catholicism, clan-like loyalty, and a wild, musical resilience, was the engine that kept the Irish regiments going. It allowed them to endure the unendurable. When the rations failed, when the boots wore out, when the rain turned the roads to liquid mud, the Irish soldier fell back on a deep, ancestral toughness. He had known hardship in Connaught. He could survive it in Castile. He joked to keep the fear at bay. He drank to numb the pain. And he fought because he could not let his brothers down. Wellington may have provided the strategy, but it was this internal, tribal spirit that provided the endurance. By 1814, the tide had turned irrevocably. The French were in retreat. Wellington's army, now a seamless machine of veterans, crossed the Pyrenees and invaded France itself. The Irish regiments, depleted but unbroken, marched at the vanguard. They had walked from the coast of Portugal to the heart of the French Empire. They had left a trail of graves across the peninsula. When the guns finally fell silent after the Battle of Toulouse, the cost of the victory began to be tallied. It was a bill paid in blood, and the Irish share was disproportionately high. In some battalions, the turnover of men due to death, wounds and disease was over 100%. The wild geese who had flown to Spain had been decimated. For the survivors, there was no grand homecoming. There were no parades in Dublin or Cork. The British Army, having defeated Napoleon, began to downsize rapidly. Thousands of men were discharged, given a small pittance, and cast back into the civilian world. This return was often a bitter tragedy. The Irish soldier returned to a land that was still gripped by poverty and political repression. He had fought to save the crown, but the crown had not changed its policies toward him or his faith. He returned to being a tenant farmer, a labourer, or a beggar. The camaraderie of the mess tent was gone, replaced by the struggle for survival. Many found they could not settle. The skills they had learned, the drill, the discipline, the violence, had no place in a peaceful, rural society. This dislocation fueled a massive diaspora. Thousands of veterans, finding nothing for them in Ireland or Britain, took ships to the New World. They carried their medals and their scars to the United States, to Canada, and to Australia. They became canal diggers, railroad builders, and policemen. They brought the military traditions of the Peninsular War to new frontiers. It is no coincidence that the early police forces in many American cities were heavily Irish. These were men who had learned their trade under Wellington, but back in the history books, a silence began to fall. The narrative of the Peninsular War was being written by the officers, largely English aristocrats who wrote memoirs celebrating their own leadership. In these accounts, the Irish soldier was often reduced to a caricature, the drunken brawler or the amusing peasant, rather than the backbone of the army. The British victory became a symbol of national unity, and the inconvenient fact that it was achieved by a multinational, largely Catholic force was quietly sanded away. This erasure was not just an accident of history, it was a political necessity. To acknowledge that the empire relied so heavily on Irish bayonets was to admit a dangerous dependency. It complicated the narrative of British superiority. And so, for 200 years, the statue of Wellington has stood in London, and the paintings of the redcoats have hung in galleries, while the accent of the army that made it all possible faded from memory. The Irish soldier became the invisible man of the Napoleonic Wars, essential, ubiquitous, and ignored. But history is not static. It is not a fixed monument, but a living thing that changes as we ask new questions of the past. Today, we have the opportunity to walk back onto those battlefields, to clear away the fog of nationalistic myth-making and to listen for the voices that were silenced. When we look at the Peninsular War now, we no longer see a simple clash of empires. We see a vast human tragedy, a crucible where identity was forged in fire. We are finally beginning to reclaim the legacy of the Irish soldier. In regimental museums, in genealogical archives, and in the work of modern historians, the invisible hand of Wellington's army is being revealed. We are realizing that the story of the British Empire is inextricably the story of the Irish people, a story of entanglement, exploitation, and extraordinary resilience. For the millions of people around the world who claim Irish descent, in Liverpool, in Boston, in Sydney, in Toronto, this story is personal. If you have an ancestor who left Ireland in the early 19th century, there is a strong chance that he did not just fade away. He may have stood in the square at Waterloo. He may have stormed the breach at Badajoz. He may have taken the king's shilling not out of love for the king, but out of love for his family, using that bounty to keep a roof over their heads for one more winter. This realization forces us to confront a more nuanced version of heritage. The redcoat, often a symbol of oppression in Irish history, was also the uniform worn by hundreds of thousands of Irishmen. It was the clothing of their survival. To dismiss them as collaborators, or to ignore them as inconvenient, is to dishonor their struggle. They were men caught in the gears of a massive historical machine. and they navigated it with a courage that demands our respect. When you visit the monuments to Wellington in London or Dublin today, look closely. Look past the bronze generals and the stone laurels. Imagine instead the faces of the boys from the bogs of Connaught and the slums of Dublin. Imagine the sound of the Uilleann pipes drifting over the Spanish plains. They were the muscle, the blood, and the spirit of the army. They were the secret weapon that broke Napoleon. They were the Irish. And it is time their story was told, loud and clear, under the sun. Thank you for joining me on this expedition into the forgotten ranks of the Peninsular War. History is often written by the victors, but as we've seen today, the true story is found in the lives of the men who actually fought it. If this documentary changed the way you view Wellington's army, or if you have your own ancestors who took the King's shilling, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Let's get a discussion going about the hidden histories that deserve to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel get these stories out to more people. And if you want to explore more of the untold history of the 18th and 19th centuries, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, keep digging.